Welcome to The Analysis. I'm Greg Beaupert. Last week, Raul Castro stepped down as leader of Cuba's Communist Party. One could say that this signaled the end of an era, although one could also say that it has been a long, drawn-out end, with the death of Fidel Castro in 2016, Raul Castro stepping down from the presidency in 2018 and turning it over to Miguel Díaz-Canel, and now, 3 years later, Díaz-Canel also takes over the leadership of the Communist Party. Meanwhile, Cuba is facing a severe economic crisis, first caused by the intensification of US sanctions against Cuba during the Trump presidency, and now the effects of the coronavirus pandemic. Joining me to discuss the current situation in Cuba is Reed Lindsay, who joins me from Cuba's capital, Havana. Reed is a documentary filmmaker and the director of the film series The War on Cuba, which was produced by the film organization Belly of the Beast, which is available on social media and YouTube. Here's a brief clip from the documentary The War on Cuba.
People come to Havana looking for the real Cuba. But this is not my Cuba. We've got one huge problem: the economy. The United States has been waging war against Cuba for 60 years. Impacta cada aspecto de nuestra vida.
Estas son de aluminio y fibra de plástico. Existen unas prótesis más resistentes, con más calidad, pero el gobierno americano no deja que la compren.
The Trump administration has killed a deal that would allow Cuban baseball players to play for Major League Baseball.
En caso de que tú quisieras jugar con la MLB,
tendría que renunciar a mi país, no me gustaría, la verdad.
Trump administration is imposing new restrictions on U.S. travel to Cuba.
Tourism stopped. You are suffocating the Cuban people.
Thanks for joining me, Reed.
Thanks, Greg, for having me.
So let's start with the party Congress and Raul Castro stepping down. Raul himself emphasized the slogan of continuity, but how is Raul's departure being perceived by ordinary Cubans? Is it more associated with more of the same, or are there expectations that some things will change, and if so, what?
Well, I would say that I think when it comes to Raul and you could probably say the same about Fidel. There was a much greater focus on it in the United States than in Cuba, as far as the possibility of change. I know that this Congress got a lot of coverage in the U.S. and internationally, and people asking this question about what does this mean for Cuba? Will there be a big change? I can't say that I noticed a lot of people, in the ordinary Cubans, talking about this much. I think that continuity is assumed, and I also think that right now Cubans are the economic situation is so dire at the moment that most Cubans are very focused on the day-to-day, trying to get through the economic crisis, this COVID crisis, which is related to the economic crisis. And the recent the Communist Party Congress is sort of something that everybody knew was going to happen anyway, and not something that people were really focused on as something that was going to produce any kind of political change.
As you mentioned, the two main challenges that Cuba is facing, and also as I mentioned in the introduction, are the economic crisis and the sanctions and the pandemic. So let's start with the sanctions and the economic crisis, which is also the main topic of your film series, The War on Cuba. Give us a brief overview as to how the US-Cuba relationship has evolved since Obama's opening towards Cuba in 2014, 2015.
Yeah, so Obama ushered in historic change with Cuba, engagement with Cuba, and it seemed a real fundamental change in the way politics and policy around Cuba happened in the United States. I mean, for many years, to win an election in the United States, you needed to pander to the Cuban American hardliners in Florida, and Obama seemed to break that break with that and engaging with Cuba, and it seemed like there was a political calculation behind it. In other words, I don't need them to win Florida, and he didn't. And so because of the changing demographics, it seemed the waning influence of the Cuban American community in Florida, greater numbers of Latin American immigrants from other parts of the Americas, younger, older Cuban Americans who are more sort of hardline in their views dying out, and younger generations not caring so much and not wanting this embargo to continue. And it seemed things had really changed, and there was no going back. In fact, during the Republican primaries in late 2015, early 2016, we interviewed Cubans about the Republican candidates and asked them what their thoughts were. And it was really interesting because a lot of them saw Trump not favorably. They all preferred the Democrat. They all preferred Clinton, but they didn't see Trump as a threat to Obama's policy. In fact, we have one great clip that is in the war in Cuba of a young man saying that it was irreversible. When we asked him, he thought things could change with the Republican candidate. He said, absolutely not. It's irreversible. You can't go back now. The cat's out of the box. It's over. But Trump was elected, and things did go back. And not only did they go back to how they were before Obama, it was even worse in some ways. There are some ways in which Trump's policy towards Cuba was worse than ever. For example, he implemented Title III of Helms-Burton, which allows for lawsuits in the United States, for example, against companies for allegedly trafficking in stolen property. So there are Spanish companies, for example, that have joint ventures with the Cuban government, hotels and whatnot, and they can be sued by, let's say, a U.S. citizen who's Cuban, who owned that property in the past, and it was nationalized, and that had never been done before. And that these lawsuits don't seem to be have a lot of potential for succeeding. But they've really been extremely damaging in terms of stopping foreign investment. It's just scared away foreign investors. Other things that, and then basically Trump just rolled back everything that Obama had done. So all of the tourism that from the United States that was occurring under Obama, an influx of tourists from the U.S., that stopped because they made it more difficult for U.S. tourists to go. The commercial flights continued, but they were scaled way back, so there were no more flights to the provinces, only to Havana. The cruise ships that were coming to the island stopped completely. He put this is toward the end of the administration, put Cuba back on the state sponsor terrorism list, which is also, it's not just a symbolic thing. It actually has a big impact because there are consequences to that, to dealing with a state sponsor of terror for other governments and companies, banks, and so on. So it's another thing that strengthens the embargo and makes it more difficult for Cuba to have commercial relations with other countries. They did basically impose an oil blockade, so that Cuba had great difficulty in obtaining oil from Venezuela, and as a result, there was an energy crisis in Cuba. They're cut back remittances. Like right now, if you wanted to send me money, it would be very difficult to arrange that. You'd literally have to probably come here with cash to be able to get me money, because from the U.S. you can't do it. You used to be able to do it through Western Union. That's no longer possible. He carried out a very strong campaign against Cuba's international medical program. Cuba has 30,000 doctors around the world, in countries all around the world that are on missions. Many of them are altruistic, and Cuba receives nothing in return. But in some cases, Cuba does receive money in return. They use that money to subsidize their healthcare system. And in the case of, for example, Brazil, Ecuador, Bolivia, those doctors were sent home. And Cuba, in Bolivia, it didn't matter because Cuba wasn't making any money there. But Brazil, they did receive a fair amount of money, and they used that money again to subsidize the healthcare system. So that was gone. So they've sort of attacked, the U.S. government has attacked Cuba on all fronts. And even before COVID hit, the situation was very bad. And in fact, in the war in Cuba, one of the people we interviewed says that things were getting as bad as they were during the special period in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union, when Cuba was in a major depression. And then COVID hit, and it was like whatever Trump was unable to do, COVID has done. So the economic situation is very dire right now. The sanctions have not lifted, and they've only intensified under COVID, under Trump, and Biden has basically, it's been the status quo so far. And while there's a lot of hope with Biden being elected that he would, reassume Obama's policy, having been the vice president under Obama, and having brought in his administration some people who were very pro-engagement and directly involved in engagement. So far, that hasn't happened, and his administration's given every indication that at least in the short term, it's not going to happen. In fact, his special assistant, Juan Gonzalez, who's also the National Security Council, the person in charge of the National Security Council for Latin American policy, came out and has said to the New Yorker and also in CNN publicly that he said that Biden is not Obama when it comes to Cuba policy, that they are not going to invest political capital in the short term. Essentially, he's alluding to Florida and the fact that there will be a political cost for reversing Trump's policies. It will cost them votes in Florida potentially, and it's just not something that they want to do in the short term. They might do some measures like restore the ability to send remittances and try to make travel for family members easier. But outside of that, they're not going to do much. Oh, there's one other thing that Trump did, which is very significant. He basically closed the embassy because of alleged sonic attacks, which by all accounts, all the evidence we have were neither sonic nor attacks. There's no evidence of either. Based on this idea of these attacks, alleged attacks by Cuba or Russia or some enemy of the United States, and again, no evidence of attacks, but based on that, they shuttered the embassy, which makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for Cubans to get a visa, to travel to the United States. If you're a Cuban, you want to get a visa right now, you've got to go to Guyana or Mexico or Colombia, spend thousands of dollars, wait there for 2 weeks while the whole process is taking place. And even then, they reject about 80% of the visas. So for most people, even well-known musicians who have contacts, who are getting invitations to travel and so on, they can't go. And so that's had a huge impact on Cuba's economy and culturally as well, and as far as just exchanges and with the United States. And there isn't any indication Biden's going to change that, because Gonzalez also said, and this is really telling, he said when he was asked about this question about restoring consular services, he said, yeah, the thing is, we can't do that because of a threat to our diplomats, because of the microwave attacks, or whatever it is they're calling it these days. He literally said, whatever it is they're calling it these days. In other words, he didn't really seem to give much importance of whatever it is they are calling it. And they are calling it microwave attacks now. It's no longer sonic attacks. Now it's microwave attacks, although there really isn't any evidence of any such weapon, microwave weapon, that could inflict the damage that supposedly was caused on these diplomats. So there's no really evidence that they were microwave either. And the most recent study that came out about that from the National Academy of Sciences said that the microwave that the microwave attacks was it didn't say that there were microwave attacks. It said that of all of the possibilities we've considered, this seems to be more likely than the others, but basically still no evidence and still probably not likely to have occurred. But it still is being used politically as a pretext to not reopen the embassy. And to take that on and to reopen it would be, obviously, for Biden, assuming political costs, and it's one that the administration doesn't seem willing to assume. In the meantime, Cubans, the economy here is just in dire straits. It's really bad. The Cubans are waiting for hours in line to get food. There are increasing scarcities of food, medicine, antibiotics, basic things that even during the sanctions under Trump there were, but now with COVID and the further tightening of sanctions, it's even harder. I spoke recently with an official who was telling me that for example, banks that they were dealing with in Europe and Switzerland, they're having more and more difficulty dealing with. They're not accepting their the transactions, and that the embargo is difficult because it's not necessarily that the Cuba can't get this medication from the United States. and they can only get it from the US. Usually you can get a medication from another country. But let's say Cuba wants to do business with India for a generic drug. Well, then the problem is not doing business and getting the drug from India, but it's sending the money to India, because the banks there won't accept the money, because if they do, they could be fined essentially by the U.S. So it's very difficult for Cuba to do business. Everything, the cost, it makes it so that the cost for Cuba for obtaining anything from outside is far higher than it would be otherwise, and the result are scarcities here on the ground. So things are very difficult now, and the hope is that the vaccine, which is in the final phases right now and is coming, it will be rolled out very soon, will sort of open the country up to tourism again, and allow the economy to get rolling once again.
Well, in the meantime, though, has the Cuban government done anything to address the sanctions or the embargo and the tightening or the difficult economic situation in Cuba?
Has the government done anything to address in what sense?
Yeah, I mean, what? Well, I mean, in terms of, one of the things, it's of course very difficult, but I mean, I guess trying to replace imports or trying to increase domestic production in some way in order to be less dependent on imports. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, the government is, well, first, the Cuban government has been dealing with the embargo for 6 decades. So this is an intensification of that. Obviously, it's very difficult to identify whose fault is what. And with this debate on the embargo, with the lack of production in Cuba, and Cuba's dependence on imports for food, for example, like how much fault does the embargo have? How much fault does the Cuban government have? When you read an article in the New York Times or in a mainstream publication, they will always cite mismanagement of the economy. It's almost like they've got those words there, copy and paste, because it's in every article. Cuba's economy is terrible because of mismanagement of the economy, and then because of the embargo. It's those two things, but which is which? It's difficult to know. It's been, and clearly, the Cuban government couldn't take measures, and one of the measures it has been taking in recent years is opening the economy up, or trying to, moving in that direction at least. There's a new constitution that was passed that allows for private companies to be formed, private businesses, and that's completely new. They've expanded the list of what they call cuentapropistas, which are sort of small business owners, and it was more restricted in terms of what activities they could do. That's been expanded. Recently, they've sort of been deregulating the agricultural sector. There was a law that was passed just very recently about a regulation about the ability to slaughter cattle, for example. So there have been measures to try to spark more investment. There's been talk of opening up investment more to Cuban Americans, for example, and making things easier for the private sector in Cuba to grow. So that seems to be the direction that the government is moving in terms of trying to deal with the economic situation. It's sort of the direction, though, that was moving in even when things were opening up with Obama. So I don't think that's necessarily I think some of the measures are a response to, depending on maybe how fast they move, a response to the embargo and how desperate things are happening. The biggest economic measure in the last year, for example, has been the unification of the currency, which, and I'm not an expert in economy, but I think the basic idea, there were two currencies, and one of the ideas behind it is that there's a lot of state companies that are inefficient and essentially losing money, and because they're selling goods in one currency and buying them in another, and sort of by eliminating the dual currency and having a single currency, the idea is that some of these companies will go out of business, and some of that business will be replaced by the private sector. So those are the type of reforms that are going on. It's at a slow pace, and it's happening, but it's also very hard in the context of the sanctions plus COVID and the total lack of tourism and almost no and very little economic activity. This is not quite the environment in which new businesses are flourishing or investments coming in, and I mean everybody's sort of braced trying to get through at least until COVID. This COVID situation improves and tourism starts to return and money starts to flow back into the country. I mean, I think last year the numbers were that Cuba had about half of the foreign currency that it had the year before. I mean, that's a pretty major blow. I mean, it's incredible the country's still staying afloat, given that it has basically half the money to work with as far as foreign currency.
All right. Now, I would want to turn to the second challenge, which you already addressed, which is specifically the pandemic. One of the successes that Cuba can point to is that it has had a very low infection rate. Why has that been the case? What has Cuba done to minimize the spread of the virus?
Well, Cuba's healthcare system, which is universal and free, is based on preventative healthcare, preventative community-based healthcare. So that's the underpinnings of the entire healthcare system. And so I've spoken with U.S. citizens who are graduates of Cuba's Latin American Medical School here, who are in the U.S. on the front lines fighting against COVID in communities in the U.S. And they've told me, like, we were really prepared for this because we know how to deal with limited supplies, and we know how to deal with epidemics because that's what they're trained in doing. And they're trained in doing it in a very preventative way. So when COVID hit, first of all, there was a mask mandate almost immediately, which I remember talking with people in the U.S. and because there was some debate earlier about the masks and whether it really worked. And I think I remember talking to my mom and her saying, well, yeah, but I'm not so sure. The masks maybe don't even help. And Cuba it was obligatory from the very beginning. You have to wear masks everywhere. And they were right about that. And it continues to this day. There's no debate about that. You have to wear a mask. Everybody wears a mask. You don't leave the house without it. The other thing they do is, because of, and they're very well equipped to do this because of the community-based healthcare and the fact that there's basically a doctor and a clinic in every neighborhood. There's one just a block from where I live, and it's free. And they know everybody who's in my neighborhood. They know who I am, and they know my health history as well as all my neighbors. So when COVID hit, they did what they call pesquisaje, which is basically going door to door every day. So every day there was a knock on the door, a doctor, nurse, sometimes dental students, medical students, sort of a whole army of mostly young people going to door every single day. How are you feeling? Asking, are you washing your hands? Answering any questions you might have about prevention, and just nipping things in the bud, making sure that there are no symptoms, and anyone who has symptoms, they immediately would be attended to. But what I think is really the biggest thing that they did to keep the numbers low is contact tracing. The contact tracing is really remarkable here. If there is a COVID case, they immediately form an emergency brigade, basically, that is done through the local health clinic, but that is also coordinated through the larger health authorities, municipal and provincial. And they come to the neighborhood and they basically survey the whole neighborhood. Anybody who's has been in contact with a person, family members, neighbors, and so on, other people, colleagues at work. They got in a taxi. They tracked down the taxi driver, and initially at first, all of those people would go into isolation. And they created isolation centers in schools and public buildings, and people would go and you'd spend 2 weeks in isolation center for not just people who had COVID, but also the people who had COVID go to hospitals. Everyone. That's automatic. So there's no question about that. And then people who were contacts of people who had COVID would go into isolation. Now the cases have risen quite a bit since December. And so there's not enough facilities for the people who are contacts. So, if you're a contact, you have to stay in your home. So you don't leave your house for approximately 10 days, 2 weeks. So that's and if you're coming into the country, it's the same deal. Like I just recently came to the US, went to the US, came back. I had to isolate for basically 8 days. I had the PCR test the day I arrived. I couldn't leave my house for 5 days. Another PCR test. When 2 days later, I came back negative, and then I could leave my house.
So the other thing, though, as you mentioned, is Cuba's developing COVID vaccines, and I believe there are 5, 2 of which are in the third and final phase of trials at the moment. Now, if successful, that would make Cuba probably the only developing country to create a COVID vaccine. How did this come about, and what is, as far as you know, Cuba planning to do with these vaccines?
Well, Cuba has a real cutting-edge biotech sector, despite being a country with very low resources and that faces all the challenges of the embargo. Since the 1980s, Fidel Castro took a great interest in this possibility, and they invested a lot of the few resources that they had into developing a biotech sector and the ability to basically not depend on the United States. And that is really a response to the embargo, because Cuba would be in big trouble right now, like a lot of other countries are, if it didn't produce its own vaccine, because it sure isn't getting from the U.S. Even if the U.S. wasn't hoarding vaccines, Cuba would not be getting the vaccine from the United States, and probably not, and possibly not from other countries as well. So I think a recognition of that, of the fact that Cuba had to be sovereign and not be dependent in the area of health. This biotech sector was developed, and in fact, the principal, the vaccine, the one that I probably will have, they came to my house just the other day and knocked on the door and doing a survey again, figuring out who's in the neighborhood to prepare for the vaccine, because it's being rolled out in Havana. If not right now, in the coming week, in my neighborhood, it'll be on May 8th. They'll start to distribute the vaccine, and all of Havana, close to 2 million people, are going to be vaccinated in the coming weeks. So anyway, the vaccine that I would be getting is called Soberana, which means sovereign, and the meaning is obvious. It's Cuba is very proud of its sovereignty. And its biotech sector is a big example of that. I mean, there are all sorts of institutions that are dedicated to research and development of vaccines and other medicines. Cuba produces the majority of medicines, just basic medicines as well, not vaccines. Again, because it knows it can't depend on it. Although that sector is also very affected by the embargo, because often they can't get the basic ingredients they need to produce them. So they have the labs, they know how to produce them, they have all the technology, but they can't get a certain the reagents or the chemicals or whatever it is they need to produce the medications they need. And in fact, right now there's a big campaign happening in the United States and around the world to donate syringes, because Cuba has the vaccines, they don't have syringes. There's a scarcity of syringes. So those are the type of the challenges Cuba has. It's sort of crazy. You have syringe is sort of this basic thing. It's a common thing that you can't get here, and but yet they have this incredible technology, and they're producing a vaccine, whereas no other country in Latin America is doing so. It's now the idea with the vaccine is that they're producing enough not just for Cuba, but for other countries as well. There are clinical trials going on in Iran, and so Iran will also be rolling out the Cuban vaccine shortly. And Cuba's international medical program is basically is about South-South cooperation, and I expect that the vaccine will be sort of a part of that in terms of they've announced that they're going to have 100 million doses by the end of the year. I don't know, some of the vaccines, it takes multiple doses to complete the cycle. So I don't know exactly how many will be exported, and they haven't really clarified that. But the expectation is that the vaccine will be going to different parts around the world. And there are countries and people in different countries in the South around the world that realize they're not going to be able to get the U.S. vaccine. that have been asking for it. In fact, Colombia, which is a very close U.S. ally, there have been increasing calls in Colombia, even among mainstream publications there, calling for the government to try to work with Cuba to get the Cuban vaccine because they know they're not going to get it from the U.S.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot, so I think we're going to leave it there. I was speaking to Reed Lindsay, documentary filmmaker and director of the film series The War on Cuba, which you can get on bellyofthebeast.cuba.com. Thanks again, Reed, for having joined me today.
Thanks, Greg.
And thanks to our viewers and listeners for joining the analysis. Please don't forget to head to our website at theanalysis.news and make a donation so we can continue to provide programming such as this.